Hi everyone, welcome to webinar 4 in our data exchange webinar series. In today's webinar, we're going to talk about privacy and consent. So as always, there are 3 key topics we'll discuss. First, I'm going to talk about key privacy and consent principles for the whole TEI program. So we'll talk about what sort of practices every single organization should have in place. Then we're going to talk specifically about using the data exchange. So we'll talk about what practices you need to have in place if you're storing clients' personal information in the data exchange. And then I'll also go through some of the frequently asked questions we get about consent and privacy. So can a child consent? How do you determine if someone has capacity to consent? All of the common issues everyone faces. So in our previous webinars, I introduced everyone to this document, the Data Exchange Quick Start Guide. Everyone should recognize this slide by now. So this is a 5-page document that outlines the 11 key steps you need to follow to access and start using the Data Exchange. It has links to key resources, and as you can see on the slide, it includes this checklist so you can keep track of where you're up to. So as you can see, we've been going through each of these steps in all of our previous webinars, and we are currently up to step 7 out of 11. So step 7 is to check your organization's consent and privacy practices. So it takes you through what you need to do to ensure your organization lawfully collects and stores and uses clients' information. There are specific practices and principles that we all need to follow. So today I'm going to take you through them and we'll break down what everything means and what you actually need to do in practice. So the first thing we're going to talk about is your general privacy obligations in the TEI program. So this applies to every single organization who receives funding from TEI. So as part of the TEI program, when you collect personal and health information from your clients, there are key pieces of legislation that you need to adhere to. So this is outlined in clause 18 in your contract, and you can see on the screen that there are 3 privacy acts. There is the Privacy and Personal Information Act, the Health Records and Information Privacy Act, and the Privacy Act of 1988. These documents are enormous, and there is so much jargon in them that anyone and everyone could get very lost and confused. So we've developed a resource called the Privacy Information Sheet. You can see a hyperlink to that at the bottom, on the bottom right of the screen, to break down all of the privacy legislation and clearly explain what it is that you need to do to make sure that you lawfully collect and use clients' information. So the first thing everyone needs to get across is what actually is personal and health information. What do we mean by that? So personal information is information about someone that can be used to identify them. So for example, this could be their name or their address. Health information is information about someone's physical or mental health. So these could be medical records, notes from a client's counseling session, a client's Medicare number, any information about them that relates to their physical or mental health. So when you collect personal and health information from your clients, there are a number of things that you need to do to make sure you adhere to this legislation. So the first thing is your client must be given a privacy notice. So this is normally just a 1-page document that clearly explains why you're collecting their information and what you're going to do with it. Any privacy notice should be written clearly and simply, and it should always be truthful. We cannot mislead our clients in any way. Many of you will already have a privacy notice that you've been using for quite some time. For those of you that don't, you must develop one for your clients to make sure your data collection practices are legal. As you can see, there are 9 different points on this slide that start to cover what sort of information should be in your privacy. So, first, client information is actually collected from them. You explain why that information is being collected and how that information is made to make they get access to the right kinds of services. You also need to tell your client who the information is for and who it might be shared with. So is it just for your service, or will you share the information with other organizations to facilitate referrals, for example? You need to tell the client if the information they provide is required by law or if it's voluntary. In the vast majority of our circumstances, it is going to be voluntary. So you need to clearly communicate that to clients, that they're not obligated to answer all of the questions you have for them. Any consequences if the client doesn't provide certain information should also be outlined. So maybe you won't be able to refer them to another organization if they don't give you their full, for example. You should also include information about their right to access and correct the information they give you and who they should speak to if they have any questions. So you should have contact details for them to discuss any issues they might have about you storing their personal information or how you're going to use it. Now, it's important to remember this is not an exhaustive list. There are over 550 targeted early intervention organizations who all engage with their clients and the service system in different ways. So you need to make sure that whatever privacy notice you develop, it is tailored to your organization's specific operating context. So the next thing I want to discuss is using and disclosing clients' personal and health information. So we all need to make sure that whenever we use clients' personal and health information, or whenever we disclose that information, which means passing it on to another party, our practices are lawful. So in order to do that, you should follow the advice on this slide. So you can only use clients' information if the proposed use is consistent with the purpose for which it was collected. So basically, this means you can only use a client's personal or health information to make sure they receive the services they need to receive. You can't use it for any other reason. So for example, you have a list of your client's email addresses. You can't use that list to promote your side business or something like that. You can only use clients' information if they have consented for their information to be used for that purpose. So we'll talk more about this in a minute, about everything and anything that has to do with consent. And then the last one you can see on the slide is you can only use clients' information if it is necessary to prevent or lessen a serious threat. So if you have a serious reason to believe that a client's life is in danger, for example, you can use their personal information to prevent something terrible from happening. Disclosures. So to disclose information means to give personal or health information collected by your organization to a person or body outside of your organization. So for example, your organization may pass on client details to another organization to facilitate a referral. Your organization may also disclose personal or health information to a school or a parent or to the police if you need to report abuse, for example. So when considering whether or not a disclosure is permitted under the privacy legislation, you should check whether the disclosure is directly related to the purpose for which the information was collected. So if you are facilitating a referral, that typically will meet the purpose of why you've collected it, because it's ensuring that the client receives the services that they need. You also need to ensure that the client has been made aware that information of that kind is usually disclosed. So your privacy notice should clearly indicate that some of their information may be disclosed in certain circumstances. And again, you can disclose a client's personal or health information if it is necessary to prevent or lessen a serious or imminent threat to the client. Now, it's really important to remember that these principles only apply to personal and health information. That is information that you can use to identify a client, their name and their address. These principles do not apply to de-identified data. So that's information that cannot be used to identify a client. So, for example, the data you report to DCJ is identified. We cannot see any personal information about your clients. So therefore, it's not considered a disclosure because you're not actually giving DCJ any information that we could use to identify your clients. So in order for you to lawfully use your client's personal and health information, they need to give you their consent. This means you will need to develop a consent form or include some consent statements at the end of your privacy notice. So when we obtain consent, there are 5 principles we need to adhere to. Consent must be voluntary. Clients should never be coerced to give their consent. They must be free to exercise genuine choice to provide or withhold consent. So that means that they have to be free to say no and still receive the service. They must also be free to say yes and change their mind at any time, which I've seen happen quite a bit. Consent must also be informed. So clients must be clearly informed about how their personal and their health information will be handled so they can decide whether or not to give consent. If your organization provides incorrect or misleading information about how a client's information will be used, then the consent that they give could be invalid. Consent must also be precise and as specific as possible. So your consent form should include a request for each use and disclosure of a client's information. So you need to think through all the ways your organization will use your client's data, and you need to get your client's permission to use their data in that way. So on the slide, you can see a few different examples. We've got, I consent for blah, blah, blah service to collect and store personal and health information about me. I consent for blah, blah, blah service to share my personal and health information with relevant agencies to provide me with support. So that's going to cover you for the referrals you conduct. I consent for my personal and health information to be stored in the data exchange. And I consent to participate in follow-up research, surveys, or evaluation. Those last 2 we'll talk more about in a minute when it comes to talking about the data exchange specifically. Consent also needs to be current. So you must not assume that consent given in particular circumstances applies indefinitely. So good practice would be to check in with your clients to make sure they haven't changed their mind about consent, to make it clear that a client is entitled to change their mind and they can revoke their consent later on if they want to. You also need to check that a client has capacity to give consent. So a person has capacity to give consent if they understand the general nature and effect of how their personal and health information will be used, and if they can actually communicate their consent. It's also a good idea to have a conversation with your clients about your privacy notice, about consent, to make sure they understand everything. If you determine that they don't have capacity to give consent, you should mark on their consent form that consent hasn't been given. This doesn't mean that the client won't receive the service. This just means that you won't collect and use their information the same way you would other clients. So you might de-identify them or use a pseudonym or something like that. Another thing everyone needs to do to make sure they're adhering to privacy legislation is to make sure the information they collect is secure. So you need to remember that some of your sorry, I was having some issues with the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so another thing that we all need to make sure we're doing to adhere to privacy legislation is to make sure the information you collect is secure. So some of you will have very private and personal information on hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in your communities. So you need to make sure this information is securely stored and only the right people have access to it. So on the screen, there are a number of different things you should consider, like physical security. If you have paper documents, you should check that these are securely stored in a locked cabinet. If you have online records, you should think about who can access them. Are they password protected? You should also think about the governance within your organization. Are staff being trained to make sure clients' information is secure? Do you have a privacy management plan or a privacy policy in place? What would you do if there was ever a data breach? What would you do with sensitive information like psychology reports? How do you de-identify data? How long do you hold client records for? Your organization really should have a privacy policy that addresses each of these points to make sure the information you hold about your clients is safe and secure, and should have clear practices to follow if there is ever a security breach. Sorry, I'm having issues with the slides again. So to quickly, there are three key things your organization needs to do to adhere to the privacy legislation in your contract. So you need to have a privacy notice that tells your clients why you're collecting their information and what you're going to do with it. You need to obtain client consent. You need your client's permission to use and share their personal information. And you need to ensure the information you collect is secure. I strongly encourage each and every one of you to take a look at this document, the privacy information sheet. This goes through all of the things I've just talked about. And it includes a lot more information than what I've covered as well. So you can use that to try to make sure your organization has the right policies and practices in place, because we need to make sure that we're doing right by our clients. So to add another layer of complexity to this, we're now going to go through what you need to do to adhere to the privacy principles of the data exchange. So when you start to create client records in the data exchange, you will enter a client's name and possibly their street level address. So this is obviously personal information. So that means that we need to make sure we have our client's permission to store their personal information in the data exchange. To do this, there are three key things you need to do. First, you must use the DSS standard notification on privacy to notify clients about the data exchange. So the DSS standard notification is similar to any privacy notice. It tells clients why their information is being collected, that consent is voluntary, where to go if they have questions, all the things we spoke about earlier. You can use this statement verbatim, or you can adapt it and tailor it to your organization. You also need to obtain client consent. So you need to ask clients if they consent to their personal information being stored in the data exchange. It's number 2 in the table on the slide. And you also need to ask them if they consent to participate in follow-up research, number 3. So the image you can see on the right side of the screen is a document that we developed that is an example of a client intake form. So at the top, we've got the DSS standard notification on privacy. We tweaked it a little bit to make it easier for clients to understand. And then as you can see down the bottom, we've included our 2 consent statements. So the first one, I consent for my personal information to be stored in the data exchange. This is compulsory for all organizations who enter clients' personal information index to include. You must have this question on your privacy notices or consent forms. Then we've got our second statement about participating in follow-up research. And you can see the bold text, we've left space for any additional statements that are specific to your organization. So like we talked about earlier, if you use a client's personal information to organize referrals, you will have to ask clients for their permission to do that. So you could include an extra consent statement here for things that are specific to your organization and how you use your client's information. You can also play around with the privacy notice itself to make sure it's as relevant as possible to your organization. Now, some of you may choose not to store clients' personal information in the data exchange. You might have your own client management system that you use, and when you upload or transfer data to DEX, you might remove personal information from your files before you do that. So for you, the DSS standard notification principles don't apply because you're not storing clients' personal information in DEX. But there are other principles you still need to follow. So you still need to ask clients if they consent to participate in follow-up research, and you still need to have your own that outlines how your organization uses client information. And you still need to obtain their consent for you to use it in those ways. So all of the stuff I talked about in the first half of the webinar. So I know this is a little bit confusing and overwhelming. So we have developed some flowcharts to help you figure out what consent you need to obtain. So the yellow one on the left is for organizations who use the web-based portal directly. So anyone who manually enters data into the data exchange, so you can figure out what you need to do. And then the orange flowchart on the right is for organizations who conduct bulk uploads or system-to-system transfers. So I'm not going to go through these now because they're pretty self-explanatory, but please, if you're ever confused, download this resource using the data exchange, consent, and privacy, and you can work your way through those flowcharts to determine what your organization needs to do. Before we wrap up, I'm going to address some of the common questions we get about consent and privacy. So all of the questions I'm going to go through are in the document I just mentioned, and I'm only going to go through 2 or 3 of them, but there are 20 different questions in that resource. So if you have any questions about consent and privacy, please take a look at it. So the first one is what to do if a client doesn't give consent to have their personal information stored in the data exchange. So the answer to this depends on how you enter or upload your data to DEX. So for organizations who are using the web-based portal directly, all you need to do is untick the consent boxes in the client record. I'll just show you what this looks like. So the image on the left is what the data exchange portal looks like when you create a client record. So you can see the red box down the bottom has the 2 data exchange consent statements. All you need to do is untick these, and personal information won't be stored in the data exchange. And these statements aren't linked to each other. So one can be ticked and the other might not be. They both might be. They both might be unticked. It's that they're separate statements that both need to be asked of clients. So if you then look at the screen on the far right, you can see the box highlighted red that says name hidden. This is what will happen when you untick that first consent box. The client's personal information will be removed, so it won't be stored in DEX because a client hasn't given permission for it to be stored. So I'm just going to go back to my table really quickly. When you untick that box, you still need to enter the client's name into the client record. So this is so a statistical linkage key can be generated. So the name won't be stored in DEX, but the system will quickly generate a code, an SLK, to de-identify the client record. And then you need to keep a record of the client's client ID. So you can go back into DEX to update their record as they continue to participate in your service. So if they participate in another activity or you add score information, you can just look up the client ID and know who that client ID belongs to. Some other common questions we get are about who has the capacity to consent. So for children, it's best practice to consent from their parent or guardian. A general rule that DSS have is that anyone under the age of 15 should have a parent or guardian consent on their behalf. You may have other clients whose capacity to consent is compromised. So in these situations, you'll have to use your own professional judgment to determine if a client can consent. Have a conversation with them about their data, what your organization will do with it, and try to determine if they fully understand what you're saying. If you determine that they don't have capacity to consent, you might be able to find someone who can consent on their behalf, like a guardian or a carer, for example. If there is no one, then you should just assume that consent hasn't been given. So here are all of the resources we looked at today. On the left are the 2 resources about the data exchange. So the top one includes all the FAQs you could ever ask for, and there is the example of the client intake form I showed you with the privacy notice and the consent statements. Also, FAMs have translated the DSS privacy notice into 14 different languages. So for those of you who work with clients and English is not their first language, you can use these translated documents to help you talk to them about privacy and consent. And then the document on the right is the privacy information sheet that talks about all the privacy stuff we all need to do, regardless of whether we store personal information in DEX or not. So as always, these are the different places you can go for help. If you have issues specifically about consent and privacy, the best place to go is to the TEI website to look at those resources I just talked about. And then you can also email their TEI inbox which, as you can see on the screen, is tei@facs.newsouthwales.gov.au. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you in the next webinar.